She threatened to have my little boy arrested for skipping rocks on a lake I legally owned. And 3 days later, I handed her a notice that made her pack up the house she had ruled from for 14 years. I know that sounds like one of those stories people make up after a bad HOA meeting and too much coffee, but I promise you, I still remember the sound of that sheriff's tires grinding over my gravel driveway, my son's hand going cold inside mine, and Evelyn Marlowe standing across the lawn in a cream-colored designer coat, pointing at us like we had just robbed a bank. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 42 then, recently divorced, tired in the bones, and trying very hard to build a quieter life for my son Caleb after a year that had already taken enough from him. I had bought a worn-down lake house outside Briar Glen, Wisconsin, a small place with cedar siding, an old dock, and windows that rattled whenever the wind came off the water. It was not fancy, not by Evelyn Marlowe standards anyway, but the first morning Caleb and I stood on that dock, watching fog lift off the lake like smoke from a campfire, he smiled for the first time in weeks, and I thought, okay, maybe we can heal here. That was before I learned that peace has a funny way of attracting people who think they own it. Evelyn lived 4 houses down in a white colonial mansion with black shutters, imported hedges, and a driveway so polished it looked like her Lexus was displayed in a showroom. She called herself the chairwoman of the Willowmere Lake Standards Council, which sounded official enough to scare people, but not official enough to show up in any county record. The first time she came to my dock, she did not introduce herself like a neighbor. She arrived like a manager inspecting a bad employee. Her heels clicked on the boards, her perfume hit me before her voice did, and she handed me a folder with rules about lake use, dock colors, visiting hours, children's noise, even approved patio furniture. I looked at the paper, then at the lake behind her, and I said, "Evelyn, I bought this property. The shoreline is mine." She smiled like I had said something adorable. "Around here, Mr. Mercer, ownership comes with responsibility." I said responsibility is fine, but fake fees are not. That was the first time her smile cracked. She leaned closer and said, "People who refuse community standards usually discover this town is less welcoming than they hoped." I should have taken that as a warning, but honestly, I was too tired to fight. I had spent years as a land acquisition consultant, reading deeds, easements, forgotten development maps. All that boring paperwork nobody cares about until it becomes a loaded gun. I knew enough to know her documents smelled wrong, but I also wanted Caleb to have pancakes on Saturday mornings, bike rides after school, and a father who was not always preparing for war. So I ignored her. Big mistake. Within 2 weeks, neighbors stopped waving. Caleb was suddenly not invited to a birthday party he had been talking about for days. A township inspector showed up over a complaint about my dock, found nothing wrong, and left looking embarrassed. Then came the anonymous note in my mailbox, printed in block letters, saying "Sell now before you embarrass yourself." I kept it because my father raised me to keep receipts, especially when bullies get sloppy. But the morning everything changed, Caleb and I were on our own shoreline at sunrise, skipping flat stones across glassy water, when Evelyn marched over with her phone already in her hand and said, "I warned you, Daniel. Children are not allowed on restricted lakefront before 8. Caleb looked up at me, confused, and I felt something inside me go still. Then she called the sheriff, and while my son stood there blinking back tears, Evelyn looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "Maybe now you will learn who really owns this neighborhood." She had no idea how right she was. The sheriff that showed up that morning was named Curtis Hale, late 50s, thick shoulders, gray mustache, the kind of man who looked permanently exhausted by other people's nonsense. He stepped out of the cruiser slow, one hand resting on his belt, while Evelyn stood beside him pretending to be the victim in some daytime courtroom show. Caleb had moved behind me by then, gripping the back of my jacket so tight I could feel his fingers trembling through the fabric. The lake was perfectly quiet except for the water brushing the dock posts and Evelyn's voice slicing through the morning air like she had rehearsed this scene in her head all night. She started talking before Curtis even reached us. Daniel Mercer continues violating community restrictions and exposing his child to unsafe shoreline conditions after repeated warnings. Curtis blinked once, looked at me, then at the fishing bucket beside Caleb, and I swear I saw him mentally calculating how badly he wanted retirement. I kept my voice calm because people like Evelyn survive by making you emotional first. Sheriff, we are standing on my property, using my dock on a public access lake. There is no HOA and there are no legal restrictions. Evelyn crossed her arms and gave me this smug little smile. That is not what the neighborhood covenant says. I almost laughed. Covenant. That word again. Curtis asked if she had county filings. She handed him one of her laminated packets like it was sacred scripture. He glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before lowering it slowly. Ma'am, this isn't recorded documentation. Evelyn's face twitched, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. People who control others for years get arrogant, and arrogance makes them careless. She pivoted immediately, saying the neighborhood had operated under those standards for over a decade and that residents voluntarily complied for the protection of property values. Voluntarily. Funny word when fear is involved. Curtis finally sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Mr. Mercer, I don't see a criminal matter here, but maybe everyone should cool down for the morning. Evelyn looked furious. He was not dragging me away in handcuffs. Caleb asked quietly, Daddy, did we do something bad? That question hit harder than anything Evelyn said. I crouched beside him and told him no, buddy, some adults just confuse power with kindness. Evelyn heard me and scoffed loud enough for the neighbors peeking through their curtains to hear. Oh, please, spare us the life lessons. You moved here 3 months ago and already think the rules don't apply to you. I stood back up and looked right at her. No, Evelyn, I just prefer rules that actually exist. She hated that. You could see it in her eyes. Bullies can survive anger, but they cannot survive embarrassment. After the sheriff left, Caleb and I went inside, and I made blueberry waffles while he sat at the counter unusually quiet, pushing syrup around his plate instead of eating. Every now and then he glanced toward the window like he expected Evelyn to appear again. That bothered me more than the threats, more than the fake documents, more than the whisper campaign she had clearly been running around town. Kids should not learn fear from grown adults who treat neighborhoods like private kingdoms. So after Caleb went upstairs to play video games, I opened my laptop and stopped trying to avoid the fight. See, back in my consulting days, my entire job was finding forgotten leverage hidden inside dusty paperwork. Old easements, abandoned rights of way, tax liens nobody noticed, dead corporations still holding ownership stakes in valuable land. Most people see documents as boring. I see patterns. And Evelyn Marlowe suddenly looked exactly like a woman standing on top of a rotten floorboard she did not realize was cracking underneath her. I started pulling county archives on Willowmere shores. Original subdivision plats, development filings, bankruptcy transfers, anything tied to the lake community. 4 hours turned into 6. Coffee turned cold beside me. The house got quiet in that lonely afternoon way divorced homes sometimes do, where every room sounds slightly unfinished. Then around dusk, I found something strange. The original developer of Willowmere Shores, Harland Coastal Properties, had gone bankrupt in 1998 during a housing collapse. Remaining assets were auctioned in bulk. Most records ended there, but one attachment referenced private roadway retention rights and common access management transferred to a holding company called Northridge Land Holdings, LLC. That caught my attention immediately because companies do not buy useless assets unless those assets control something important. I kept digging. State business registry, tax records, corporate transfers. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. Northridge Land Holdings had never dissolved. It had simply gone dormant. Then my stomach dropped when I saw the managing member listed in an old pension restructuring file. Arthur Mercer, my father. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen while the refrigerator hummed behind me. My father had worked 30 years as a union electrician in Milwaukee. Smart man, stubborn as hell, obsessed with contracts and ownership rights. After he died, I inherited a pile of scattered investment paperwork during probate, most of which I barely looked at because I was drowning in work at the time. Suddenly, memories started clicking together. A folder marked miscellaneous land assets. Old tax notices. Corporate filings I assumed were worthless leftovers. I drove to the garage and dug through storage boxes until midnight, dust everywhere, old cardboard smell filling the air. Then I found it. A faded brown file with my father's handwriting across the front. North Ridge Holdings. Inside were transfer documents showing ownership rights to the private roads servicing Willowmere shores, including access easements tied to 6 homes, one of them being Evelyn Marlowe's property. I actually laughed out loud alone in that garage, not because it was funny, but because life sometimes writes irony so perfectly it feels scripted. The woman who spent years pretending to own the neighborhood had built her entire empire on roads she legally did not control. I called an old colleague the next morning, Rebecca Sloan, forensic title specialist, smartest researcher I ever worked with. I emailed her everything and told her I needed confirmation before I made a move. By noon, she called me back, sounding half amused and half horrified. Daniel, this is real. Your father's holding company still owns the private roadway easements and undeveloped access parcels for half that subdivision. Technically speaking, Evelyn's entire driveway crosses land controlled by your company. I asked her the question already forming in my mind. So what happens if access permission gets revoked? Rebecca went quiet for a second. Then she said, well, things would get very uncomfortable for Mrs. Marlowe very quickly. That was the moment the whole fight changed. Up until then, I had been defending myself. Now I understood I was holding the pin to a grenade Evelyn did not even know existed. But I also knew something else. If I handled this emotionally, I would become the villain she wanted me to be. So I slowed down. I started documenting everything. Every fake fee, every threat, every neighbor complaint. Quiet conversations began happening around town once people realized I was not backing down. A retired nurse named Linda told me she had paid Evelyn nearly $4,000 over the years because she was afraid her grandchildren would be excluded from neighborhood events. A contractor named Wes admitted Evelyn had threatened to report his trucks for zoning violations if he stopped contributing to the so-called community maintenance fund. Another couple confessed they paid yearly dues simply because they thought everybody else did. That was Evelyn's real weapon. Not money, not legal authority, social fear. She had turned an entire neighborhood into obedient children terrified of being isolated. And once I understood that, I knew exactly how to break her power. You do not destroy fake authority quietly. You expose it publicly. I spent the next 10 days building the case carefully because when people like Evelyn finally fall, they swing wildly on the way down. I met neighbors one by one, never in groups at first, usually in kitchens that smelled like coffee and old wood polish, or garages with football games playing softly in the background while nervous people admitted things they had kept buried for years. Linda brought out folders full of canceled checks. Wes showed me text messages where Evelyn casually threatened to raise concerns with the township if he stopped cooperating. One older widower named Frank actually apologized to me for avoiding Caleb at the grocery store. Said Evelyn made it sound like I was dangerous. That one stayed with me. Imagine being so obsessed with control that you poison a child's reputation just to protect your little fake kingdom. By the end of the week, I had enough documentation to bury her 6 feet deep in civil court. But honestly, court was not what I wanted anymore. I wanted witnesses. I wanted sunlight. So I mailed Evelyn a certified letter requesting a public financial review of the Willowmere Lake Standards Council, citing concerns over collected dues and misuse of community authority. I knew she would never ignore it because narcissists do not walk away from stages. I doubled down on them. Sure enough, 2 days later she announced an emergency neighborhood meeting at her house. The email she sent was hilarious in that desperate rich lady way. In light of recent hostility threatening our community values, people always wrap ugly behavior in pretty language when they know they are cornered. The night of the meeting felt strange from the second I pulled into her driveway. Luxury SUVs lined the curb. Lights glowed through giant front windows. It looked less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a political fundraiser. Caleb was staying with my sister that evening because there was no way I was dragging him into that circus. I walked inside with a leather folder under my arm and immediately noticed Evelyn had hired actual attorneys to sit beside her at the dining table. 3 of them. Expensive suits, expensive watches, expressions that said they expected an easy intimidation job. Evelyn herself sat at the head of the table wearing pearls and a white blazer like she was auditioning to become governor. For a second, I almost admired the commitment to the performance. Almost. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile people use before setting something on fire. Daniel, thank you for finally deciding to cooperate like an adult. I sat down slowly and said, funny. I was about to say the same thing. A few neighbors shifted nervously. Nobody touched the wine she had laid out. You could feel tension hanging in the room like humidity before a storm. Evelyn opened with a speech about preserving neighborhood harmony, protecting property values, maintaining standards, all the usual nonsense insecure people hide behind when they mistake control for leadership. Then, one of her attorneys tried to steer the conversation toward voluntary community contributions. That was my cue. I opened my folder and slid copies of financial records across the table. The room got very quiet. These voluntary contributions paid for your patio renovation? I asked calmly. Evelyn's face stiffened. One attorney picked up the documents and started flipping pages faster and faster. Monthly transfers to Evelyn's personal account. Furniture purchases labeled administrative expenses. Landscaping bills. Luxury retail charges. Linda finally spoke from across the table, voice shaking. You told us the money was for snow removal. Wes leaned forward right after her. You threatened my business if I stopped paying. Evelyn tried to recover fast. I'll give her that. She laughed sharply and waved one manicured hand like we were all being dramatic. Oh, for God's sake. Every community has operational costs. That was when I pulled out the second folder. The important one. See, Evelyn, the problem is not just the money. It's the fact you spent 14 years pretending to control property you never legally controlled in the first place. Her expression changed instantly. Tiny crack. Tiny panic. I placed the easement maps on the table one at a time. Original subdivision records. Ownership transfers. North Ridge Land Holdings documentation. My father's transfer papers. Every attorney at that table suddenly sat forward at the same time. That's always a good sign. I pointed calmly to the highlighted roadway sections. These private access roads were sold after the developer bankruptcy in 1998. My family inherited controlling rights years ago, which means your driveway, Evelyn, crosses land legally managed by me. Silence. Real silence. Not television silence. The kind where you suddenly hear the air vent humming and somebody breathing too hard across the room. Evelyn stared at me like her brain physically could not process what I had just said. That's impossible. One of her attorneys spoke before I could answer. Mrs. Marlowe, did you know about any of this? She looked at him, then at me, and for the first time since I met her, she looked small. Not angry. Not powerful. Just scared. I leaned back in my chair and said the thing I had been waiting 2 weeks to say. You call the police on my son over lake access, while your own property access exists because my family allowed it. One neighbor actually let out a quiet holy hell under his breath. Evelyn stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped backward. This is blackmail. No, Evelyn, blackmail is threatening people for fake dues. This is called documentation. Then came the moment that finally broke her. Linda stood, then Wes, then Frank. One by one, neighbors started talking openly for the first time in years, and once fear leaves a room, bullies collapse fast. Evelyn tried interrupting them at first, but her voice kept getting drowned out. The attorneys stopped defending her completely. One of them quietly gathered his files and muttered something about undisclosed liability exposure before leaving the room altogether. Honestly, that might have been my favorite part of the night, watching expensive lawyers abandon ship in real time. By the time the meeting ended, half the neighborhood was demanding repayment plans and threatening fraud complaints. Evelyn looked exhausted, mascara slightly smeared, standing in the middle of that giant perfect dining room while her whole image cracked apart around her. 3 weeks later, she and her husband quietly listed the house. 6 months after that, they were gone. No remati gudvie, no epaligi. Just a moving truck at sunrise and a for sale sign disappearing from the lawn she used to patrol like a prison yard. The strange thing is, I did not feel victorious watching them leave. Mostly I felt relieved. Relieved Caleb could ride his bike again without whispers following him. Relieved neighbors finally waved at each other naturally instead of checking whether Evelyn approved first. Relieved that peace finally felt real instead of controlled. These days the lake feels different. Lighter somehow. Caleb fishes off the dock almost every weekend now, and every once in a while he asks if I think Evelyn ever understood what she did wrong. Truthfully, I do not know. Some people spend so long confusing authority with respect that they cannot tell the difference anymore. But I'll tell you this. The scariest people in the world are not always loud tyrants. Sometimes they are polished, smiling, respected neighbors hiding behind fake rules and social pressure while everybody else stays quiet, because it feels easier. So now I want to ask you something. If you found out someone in your neighborhood had been manipulating people for years the way Evelyn did, would you expose them publicly like I did, or would you walk away and protect your peace? And be honest, because situations like this happen a lot more often than people think.